deserve a brighter future. Universitas Terbuka is established to make the dreams of young men and women from all corners of the country come true through the distance higher education system to meet the ever-changing demands of industrial and technological development in the 21st century.
Dengan diresmikannya Universitas Terbuka.
Universitas Terbuka is a pioneer of world-quality distance higher education, which is supported by professional lecturers who are experienced in their own field of expertise. Universitas Terbuka has also made numerous innovations to solve current educational challenges by applying a digital learning ecosystem to build capable and quality future leaders.
Hampir 4 dasawarsa UT mengabdi untuk bangsa. Universitas Terbuka mewujudkan pendidikan tinggi untuk semua.
With the long experience of carrying out our mission of providing equal access to higher education for everyone in Indonesia, Universitas Terbuka has proven to be a trusted public higher education institution. Our graduates have successfully applied their knowledge into their chosen career fields as either professionals or entrepreneurs. As of 2022, UT has a student body of just over 350,000. As a cyber university who teaches and applies the latest technology, Universitas Terbuka has 4 faculties, including the Faculty of Economics, the Faculty of Law, Social and Political Sciences, the Faculty of Science and Technology, and the Faculty of Education and Teacher Training. As a successful distance higher education institution, UT has received various awards and achievements. For instance, the rector of Universitas Terbuka, Professor Ojat Darajat, was elected by acclamation as the president of Asian Association of Open Universities for the period of 2020 to 2022. Time and time again, UT continues to make important innovations by using the most advanced communication technology and information available in each of its programs. Through the implementation of lifelong learning, UT also provides certificate programs and tuition-free programs such as open educational resources, as well as free lectures to be accessed by everyone. Limitation is not a hindrance for people to continue their education to a higher level, because education is a fundamental human right for everyone that can be accessed easily. This is Universitas Terbuka, always thinking forward, always open to diversity.
Pendidikan tinggi bagi semua anak negeri.
Universitas Terbuka menjangkau yang tidak terjangkau.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I have attention here, please? Our event is about to begin. We sincerely appreciate your readiness to take part in this morning event. The Honorable Professor Thomas Lucey, PhD, from the School of Educational Studies, Claremont Graduate University, United States, Dean of Faculty of Education and Teacher Training of Universitas Terbuka, Professor Dr. Ucu Rahayu, MSc, Vice Dean of Academic, Dr. Dodi Sukmayadi, MSc, ED, Vice Dean for Student Affairs, Learning Service and Cooperation, Dr. Lidwina Sri Ardiasi, MED, all heads of the study program at the Faculty of Education and Teacher Training of Universitas Terbuka, all lecture from UT regional offices, and all of the attendees of today's event. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, salam kebajikan, Rahayu. Good morning to you all. Praise Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala for His blessing so we can attend this event this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Suci Nurhayati, the host of today's event. I'm very pleased to see you here. Today, on a Friday, 4th August 2023, the Faculty of Education and Teacher Training at Universitas Terbuka proudly present visiting lecture with the theme Equitable Access to High-Quality Teachers Bridging the Gap in Inclusive Education. Dear participants, before we start the event, we want to inform you that first, this visiting lecture is delivered in a hybrid session. The on-site visiting lecture was attended by the faculty members of Faculty of Education and Teacher Training Universitas Terbuka, while the online conducted on a Zoom meeting and published on UT TV for students and the public. Second, video and speaker access is only granted to the moderator and the speakers, while participants can only listen. Third, participants can also join this event from UT YouTube channel through the link that we share on the flyer. Fourth, participants can ask questions to the speakers through the Zoom meeting chat menu or Q&A feature. The moderator will present the selected question to the speaker for the response. Don't forget to write down your name and institution. And last, we will draw the selected question from the participant to get 3 prizes. Well, ladies and gentlemen, to always develop the spirit of nationalism and patriotism, first let us sing the national anthem Indonesia Raya, then continue with the UT hymn. Please all rise.
Universitas Terbuka, wadah pribadi mandiri, mengabdikan jiwa dan ragaku, menjaga lestarimu. Semoga tercapailah damai sejahtera untuk Indonesia. Jaya sepanjang masa, sepanjang masa.
Thank you. Please be seated. Well, dear audience, we will start the event by listening to the welcome speech by the Dean of the Faculty of Education and Teacher Training Universitas Terbuka. Please welcome Professor Dr. Ucu Rahayu, MSc.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. The distinguished visiting lecturer, Professor Thomas Lucie, PhD, the Vice Dean, the Head of Research, the Heads of Study Program, the lecturers at the Head Office as well as at the regional offices throughout Indonesia, tutors, and students of the Faculty of Teacher Training and Education of Universitas Terbuka. First of all, I'd like to welcome you all to the visiting lecture with the theme Equitable Access to High Quality Teachers, Bridging the Gap in Inclusive Education. My deepest gratitude and a warm welcome are also given to the distinguished visiting lecturer today, Professor Thomas Lucie, who has been willing to share his expertise and experiences. Distinguished colleagues and guests, the Faculty of Teacher Training and Education has a mandate from the Indonesian government to improve quality in service teacher through upgrading their qualification. The Faculty of Teacher Training and Education provide 11 study programs, such as Early Childhood Education Program, Elementary School Teacher Education Program, Natural Science Teacher Education Program, Social Science Teacher Education Program, and Language Teacher Education Program. In line with the technology development in education, Universitas Terbuka, including the faculty, has transformed into a modern digital higher education institution. This has been another challenge for our faculty to provide the equity and quality learning services to teachers. With its visions as an institution producing professional educators and education personnel through an open and decent higher education system, we are currently serving more than 125,000 students, dominated by students of elementary school teacher education study program, about 90,000 students, and about 27,000 students of the early childhood teacher education study program. There are three missions of the faculty. First, to improve the quality of education system and service delivery to meet the needs of educators and education personnel professionally. Second, to expand access to open and distant higher education nationally, regionally, and globally. Third, to produce and disseminate the findings of scientific, technological, and art studies in the field of education to improve the quality of educators and education personnel as well as educational institutions. We believe that Prof. Tom, with his extensive and outstanding knowledge and experiences in the relevant matters will keep us updated with the insightful sharing of information and knowledge regarding the development of education globally, especially in maintaining the equitable access to high-quality teachers in Indonesia. Once again, I congratulate our colleagues at the Faculty of Education of Universitas Terbuka for successfully hosting and organizing this visiting lecture. I strongly believe this forum will give us a memorable academic experience, provide plenty of opportunities for academic publication, and develop a new network for collaborative research. I wish you all a productive and enjoyable lecture. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Ucu Rahayu MSc, for a very insightful welcome speech. Next, we will listen to Professor Thomas Lucey, PhD, professor from Claremont Graduate University, United States, who has joined us today. Thank you and welcome to visiting lecture, the Faculty of Education and Teacher Training, Universitas Terbuka. It's a great honor that you can share your expertise today. Let us use our valuable time to listen to and discuss the presentation with Professor Thomas Lucey, PhD. The presentation and discussion activities will be guided by Siti Hadianti, MPD. Please welcome Siti Hadianti, MPD.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Ibu Suci Nurhayati, for letting me be here. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to be here to be the moderator of this event. We have already here among us Professor Thomas Lucey, PhD. So without further ado, let's invite Professor Tom to come to the front with us. Sama-sama, Prof.
Selamat pagi.
So how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here at Universitas Terbuka.
Or I heard it's your eighth time coming here? Eighth time. Okay.
Eighth time, but first time in 13 years.
First time in 13 years.
Yes.
So how is it different with the last time you visit?
It's grown.
It's
And
grown.
The
Okay.
technology has really increased dramatically. We were at the Multimedia Center yesterday, and I participated in live radio and in television, and I was really impressed with the technological advances that the university has made.
Okay, so I hope you have a good time here.
Yes,
And
wonderful.
you will go to Bali?
Yes, third time to Bali.
Third time to
Yes.
Bali. Great. All right. Ladies and gentlemen, so in this visiting lecture, Professor Tom will share to us a very interesting topic. I already seen your PowerPoint, and that's very excellent. I'm looking forward to see your presentation. The topic is equitable access to high quality teachers, bridging the gap in inclusive education. This is very relevant with our faculty, so we're really looking forward to hear your presentation. But before that, let me introduce you to all of the audiences here and also the online audience. Well, actually, Professor Tom has many outstanding achievements, ladies and gentlemen, but I will just give some highlights of your works. So Professor Tom earned his Bachelor of Arts in Latin American History from Occidental College. So you can speak Latin language?
I can speak Spanish and a little bit of Portuguese.
Oh, great. Okay. And he earned two masters. The first master's is in economics.
First master's in public affairs and then a master's.
Oh,
in
I see.
economics.
Okay. So first, the public affairs from University of Texas at
Yes.
Austin. And the second one, a Master of Economics from Stanford University.
Yes.
And he obtained his PhD in International Comparative Education from Stanford University, United States.
Thank you.
All right. All right. Now, Professor Thomas Luce is a professor in Claremont Graduate University School of Educational Studies. Your primary focus of research is the impact and availability of educational resources, particularly about high quality teachers among marginalized children and youth that you will be shared today.
Yes.
Okay. And he has conducted related research in Africa, Asia, North, Central, and South America. And you have been invited to present your research in Argentina, Colombia, Hong Kong, India, Indonesia, Mexico, and South Korea. So you almost like go around the world.
Yes. I love to travel.
Okay. And you're also the author of Teacher Distribution in Developing Countries, Teachers of Marginalized Students in India, Mexico, and Tanzania in 2017.
Yes.
You have another author here.
Dr. Amita Chudgar from Michigan State University.
All right. Okay, and also he serves as the editorial boards of several leading journals in education. One of it is International Journal of Educational Development.
Yes.
All right. We have like long list of it, but I'm sure all the audiences want to hear your presentation already. So you will be given 60 minutes. Is it enough for you?
That should be enough. But once I start talking, I may need some reminders about time.
All right. All right. Don't worry, I'm here.
Okay. Thank you. Please tell me when I have 10 minutes left, when I have 5 minutes left.
Okay, sure.
Time.
All right. And another 30 minutes will be given for the question and answer sessions. All right. Without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Should I stand at the podium?
Oh, yeah. You may take your position anywhere.
I think I would like to stand if that's okay.
Oh, sure,
All right,
sure.
Thank you. Because I've been sitting down a lot the last several days. So I can use that microphone. Good morning. Selamat pagi. Terima kasih. It's a real pleasure to be at Universitas Terbuka. As I just mentioned, this is my 8th time here, but the first time in 13 years. From 2006 to 2010, I was an assistant professor at Florida State University in the United States. And I was part of a project funded by the US Agency for International Development. And we worked with Universitas Terbuka. And I came with my colleague, Dr. Mike Spector, who's now at University of North Texas. I came here 7 times and made a lot of really great friends and colleagues. Many of those friends and colleagues came to study at Florida State University and are now leaders at the university. And one colleague I met here while I was doing a workshop at Universitas Terbuka came to study at my university, Claremont Graduate University. And that's Pa Dickey, who's right here with us. And I hope you will listen to Pa Dickey about the wonderful time he had at Claremont Graduate University. I hope it was wonderful, because we would love to have more scholars from Universitas Terbuka come study with us to do masters or PhDs in education or in other fields. My university is not very well known outside of the United States, but it's a very good small private university in Southern California, which is a very nice place to be, although it's a little hot right now. So what I'll be talking about today is something that I've been really passionate about for maybe the past 20 years. Before I entered academia, before I decided to enter academia, before I decided to pursue my PhD at Stanford University, I was a teacher, a classroom teacher in elementary school and in high school. And one thing that I saw consistently when teaching in urban schools, I taught in urban schools that are difficult to staff, often with a great deal of teacher turnover because teachers leave for more pleasant environments. So I saw the difficulty of recruiting teachers and retaining teachers in difficult to staff schools. And so this is something that I ultimately decided to write my dissertation about. But because I studied international comparative education, I decided to apply sort of an international and comparative lens to this question of who has access to qualified teachers, and if access to qualified teachers is equitable across different student populations and locations. So the title of my talk is Equitable Access to High Quality Teachers, Bridging the Gap for Inclusive Education. I'll talk about the importance of teachers and teacher quality first to kind of provide a rationale for why this is such an important topic. I know that all of you at FKIP understand teachers to be incredibly important, and you are all working to improve teacher quality here in Indonesia. But I'll just provide a little bit of research evidence to kind of support that conclusion that teachers are really important. I'll talk about teacher sorting, the phenomenon of teachers selecting different schooling environments in order to work, and how that leads to unequal access to qualified teachers. And I'll talk about that from different perspectives, cross-nationally and comparatively. And then I'll talk a little, so we know that there's a really important and difficult problem of unequal access to qualified teachers, but what we're not so sure about is what is the solution to that problem in terms of policies or practices in the classroom or in schools. So I'll talk a little bit about evidence related to ensuring that every child has a qualified teacher, and I'll talk about some research that I've conducted with colleagues in the United States and other countries. And finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about inclusion. And I haven't done as much research related to inclusive education. I've talked a lot about access to quality teachers. I've done a lot of research. So what I'd like to do is bring some resources from UNESCO, because UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Report in 2020 was devoted to the topic of inclusion. So I'd like to share some resources from UNESCO that I hope will catalyze a discussion. And please, as I talk, if you feel free to interrupt me with questions or clarifications, if there's something you don't understand or that you would like to clarify, please don't hesitate to interrupt me and to ask. All right, so let me start with the importance of teachers and teacher quality. So I think we all kind of intuitively believe that teachers are important. Many of us are or have been classroom teachers. We see the important things that happen within classrooms. We see that how much children learn from the day they start in our classrooms till the day they leave for another class, for another teacher. So we believe that intuitively, but there's also quite a bit of research evidence to support the idea that teachers are really the most important educational input in ensuring that children succeed academically in school. And when I say most important input, I'm really talking about in terms of things that schools can do to influence academic achievement. Teachers are the most important school input for students' academic success. So in 2005, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, published a big report about teachers and teacher quality. It was a study of dozens of countries across the world, mostly OECD countries, but also some OECD partner countries that were not members of the OECD. And so they sent teams out to dozens of countries. They studied policies, they studied literature, research around teachers, and they published their report in 2005. It was called Teachers Matter. And there were three broad conclusions from their review of educational literature. First is that the largest source of variation in student learning is attributable to differences in what students bring to school, their abilities and attitudes, and family and community background. So in other words, the thing that matters most for how well children do in school is really their home environment, what's happening at home, the resources they have at home, their parents' education, their parents' income, social capital in the home. And there's not so much that policymakers or educators can do to influence what happens in the home, although there are some things that I think that educators and policymakers can do. But of those variables, so that's what's happening at home, but what about what's happening in school? of those variables which are potentially open to policy influence, factors involving teachers and teaching are the most important influences on student learning. So if you think about all the things that children experience in school, all of the resources that they have access to, whether it's school buildings, whether it's textbooks or other instructional materials, whether it's school leaders, and of course teachers, the most important thing for ensuring the success of students is their teachers and the quality of their teachers, the preparation, knowledge, skills of their teachers. But when it comes to understanding what it is about teachers that's important, is it their training? Is it their experience? Is it their knowledge? Is it their enthusiasm, empathy? It's a little less clear what those correlates of teacher quality are. What is really important about teachers? So although there's a great deal of research about this question, it's still a little unclear what it is about teachers that matters. But we do know that teachers do matter. So some evidence of the importance of teachers and teacher quality, and again, much of this evidence comes from the review of literature from the OECD, quite a few studies of teacher quality in the United States. There are a lot of economists now doing econometric studies of the importance of teachers, and here are some of the conclusions. Children who move from an average teacher to a teacher at the 85th percentile of teacher quality can improve by more than 4 percentile rankings in a year, an equivalent effect of reducing class size by 10. In other words, if you have a student in a class with an average quality teacher, and then you move that student to a class with an above average teacher in terms of their teaching effectiveness, they can increase substantially in a year. And that impact is equivalent to what you would get if you were reducing class size of that child by 10. And the reason that economists use this comparison between teachers and reducing class size is that reducing class size is actually a pretty expensive policy because you have to hire new teachers. So what the economists are arguing is really let's focus on improving teacher quality. And now how do they measure teacher quality in these studies? They measure it by what they call value-added scores or value-added impact. In other words, how much increase in test scores does a student have while they're in a class of a specific teacher? And that's kind of their measure of teacher quality. Variations in teacher quality explain between 7.5% and 8.5% of total variation in student achievement, which is a far greater amount than any other school level input. In other words, the extent to which teacher quality varies in a school really has a great impact on how much students learn, and much more than any other school input. And again, underscoring the point of the importance of teacher quality. And there are also implications for equity, because an economically disadvantaged student who has 5 successive teachers who are 1 standard deviation above the mean in teacher quality. So if a student has 5 teachers in succession who are above average, that student can nearly overcome the mean difference in achievement resulting from being from a disadvantaged population. So if we have, an economically disadvantaged student has consistent access over 5 years to a very qualified teacher, they can close the achievement gap that is based on socioeconomic status. Because we know from many decades of research that children who have lower socioeconomic status, fewer resources in the home, on average underperform students who have many more resources in the home. But if we can ensure that those students have consistent access to effective teachers, that can help close those socioeconomic status-based achievement gaps. Now, the problem is that economically disadvantaged children, or children who suffer from other types of marginalization, very rarely do have consistent access to high-quality teachers. We know from many studies of teacher sorting and teacher distribution that most children who are marginalized by some type of circumstance, whether it's their home environment, their geographic location, whether it's their gender, do not have equal access to qualified teachers. And this is a problem that I've devoted quite a bit of research to, trying to understand not only what patterns look like in terms of children's access to qualified teachers, but also to understanding what causes those differences. And are there differences across countries in children's access to qualified teachers? In fact, when I was a first or second year PhD student, I saw another one of my colleagues, another student, PhD student, was doing research related to teacher distribution, teacher sorting in Mexico. And that's when I decided that's what I want to do my dissertation about, because I think this is a really important problem. And by the way, by teacher sorting, I mean the idea that teachers kind of select different locations where to work, and they often select places that are more comfortable or more pleasant. And oftentimes the teachers who get to have that choice are the more qualified teachers. And so the teachers kind of self-select themselves into more pleasant or more advantageous teaching conditions. So I'm going to talk about various studies I've done around this problem of unequal teacher distribution. But just to give a little background about what this problem looks like, we know that across the globe, and now there's a growing number of international and comparative studies of this problem, highly qualified teachers are disproportionately concentrated in better resource schools with higher achieving and more advantaged students. And this is a phenomenon that the research really started about this question in the United States, but now there's been growing international research. And it seems to be a phenomenon that we see across the globe in terms of unequal access to qualified teachers. There's also growing evidence, and now this is about differences across schools, but now there's growing evidence that there's even uneven teacher distribution across classrooms within schools. In other words, let's say there are 3 third-grade classrooms in a school, and in one third-grade classroom has children with lower socioeconomic status, and another has children with higher socioeconomic status or achievement or some other measure. It's often the case, at least in the United States, that the teachers of the students with higher socioeconomic status tend to be more qualified. Maybe they have greater experience, maybe they have higher levels of education, or maybe they have some other attribute like higher test scores or higher levels of knowledge. So this isn't just a problem across schools, it's a problem even within schools. Now, this is important because this unequal distribution of teachers leads to important achievement and resource inequalities between more and less advantaged students. So we know that teachers are important for student achievement. So to the extent that less advantaged children have less access to more qualified teachers, that's going to cause differences in achievement, greater differences in achievement. But also, we know that teachers are compensated mainly across the world according to their experience and their level of education. So teachers, to the extent that more experienced teachers are working with more advantaged students, that represents a sort of resource inequality, and that more resources in the form of teacher salaries are being concentrated with more advantaged students. Now so there's less evidence about what causes this unequal distribution of teachers. It may be caused by teacher sorting. In other words, more qualified teachers choose better resource schools. It's just a matter of how the teachers are choosing to work in schools and where they're choosing to work, or choosing to work in classrooms. Or there could be a role of educational policies and practices. So I've done some research trying to understand what are the educational policies that relate to different levels of teacher sorting and distribution of teachers. But there are few studies that have directly examined the causes or remedies for unequal teacher distribution. So we know what the problem looks like in terms of unequal teacher distribution, but we are not really sure about what the causes are and what the possible solutions are for unequal teacher distribution. So here you see a couple of tables from my dissertation that I published in a journal called Comparative Education Review. And basically what I did was I looked at 2 different states in Mexico, and I wanted to understand how do teachers look different across these two states. And within these two states, are there differences between urban and rural locations, between different levels of socioeconomic status or different levels of school achievement? And so I chose two states in Mexico. One is called Aguascalientes. It's a very small state in the middle of Mexico, in the central part of Mexico. And there aren't really big differences in terms of working conditions between urban and rural schools. So I thought maybe there won't be large inequities between urban and rural, because urban and rural is one of the big differences particularly in lower and middle income countries in terms of access to educational resources. The other state that I looked at was Sonora, which is a big state in the northern part of Mexico, where there are large differences, urban-rural differences in working conditions and living conditions. For example, in rural areas, there are very arid desert locations, areas, and in urban areas are a little more hospitable for living. So I thought, I bet I'm gonna see some differences between Aguascalientes and in Sonora in terms of what the teachers look like across urban and rural areas. But prior to examining the distribution of teachers, I actually did some analysis to understand what are the really important characteristics of teachers that as they're associated with student achievement gains. In other words, what's more important for understanding how well students do over the course of a year in terms of how much they grow in their achievement? Is it about teacher education levels? Is it about teacher knowledge? Is it about teacher experience? And so you can see, I don't know if you can see the, which of these screens should I point at for the, okay, so I don't know if you can see the pointer. There we go. I'm not sure, but you can see in that top table is the state of Aguascalientes in that, whoops. Now I need to get back. That top table is the state of Aguascalientes. And you can see the left column that has a red box around it are the characteristics of urban teachers compared to rural teachers. And you can see that consistently there are big differences that are statistically significant between urban schools and rural schools. There tend to be fewer male teachers in urban schools. There tend to be less experienced teachers in in rural schools, there tend to be more male teachers. In rural schools, there tend to be less experienced teachers and less educated teachers in terms of their levels of education. And there are, in terms of their test scores, they tend to be lower scoring in rural schools relative to urban schools. So the right column are the rural teachers and the left column are the urban teachers. And by the way, when I examined what were the important characteristics of teachers, and I looked at teachers' experience, teacher education levels, I looked at whether the teacher gender. I also looked at, I had teacher test scores. Can you guess which was the characteristic of teachers that was most consistently related to student achievement gains of all those measures? Experience, training, level of education, and teachers' knowledge. Of those characteristics, the thing that was most consistently related to student achievement gains was teachers' own knowledge, the scores that they had on tests. But what I found is in both Aguascalientes and Sonora, there were big urban-rural differences in teachers' test scores, as well as experience, as well as level of education. So there were big inequities between urban and rural areas. And so this was a primarily quantitative study. So I wasn't really able to understand why this was happening. But later, in a later study that I'll talk about, I actually did some qualitative work. I went out and interviewed people in 4 different states in Mexico. And what I realized is the whole teacher assignment and transfer system is basically set up so that the least experienced, the brand new teachers are sent out to rural areas for their first teaching assignment. And then over time, they accumulate experience, which they then use to transfer to urban schools. So what happens in rural schools is you have least experienced, least prepared teachers who over time, as they gain experience, then move to urban schools. What's that? Yes, exactly. It's a policy problem, right? I mean, you can't blame the teachers for wanting to look for more pleasant working conditions. So this is a case where the government policy really has to step in. And another interesting difference, if you can see that the male teacher variable, which is at the very top, you see that urban teachers are much more likely to be female. Rural teachers are much more likely to be male. And I did ask someone about this, and they said, "Oh yeah, that's because a young female teacher, they're never going to send her out to the mountains in the middle of nowhere because it's just too dangerous for them, and it's very unpleasant living conditions." So what this means is rural children in rural schools often have little opportunity to learn from a female teacher, which of course there are lots of inequities there, but particularly for girls in rural areas because they don't have the opportunity to have to see a female teacher, to have a female role model who's achieved the educational attainment to be a teacher. So there are lots of inequalities here in this study. But this is Mexico. Mexico is known for being very unequal in terms of socioeconomic inequality as well as educational equality. So I decided to do a comparison with a country that was known to be much more equal, which is South Korea. So in 2008, the OECD published the results and the data for their first TALIS study. TALIS is the Teaching and Learning International Survey. And what TALIS does is it surveys teachers and school leaders in lower secondary schools across the globe. And so what I did with my colleagues, Anita Chugar and Josh Rue, is we looked at teacher distribution in these two countries, in Mexico and South Korea. If you see the top left graph, oops, that's not what I meant to do. The top left graph where it says education and community size, what we're doing there is we're graphing the percentage of teachers with more than a bachelor's degree across villages, small towns, cities, and large cities. So we're looking to see if there are differences in teacher qualifications across rural areas and urban areas. And what we see on the left, Mexico, in the top left graph, on the left we see Mexico, on the right we see South Korea. In Mexico, we see more educated teachers in urban areas. The bars in Mexico are much lower because teachers on average have lower education levels in Mexico than they do in South Korea. But the bars on the left are skewed towards cities. In other words, more educated teachers tend to be located in urban areas. In South Korea, it's exactly the opposite. Whereas more educated teachers are more likely to be in villages and small towns relative to cities. So that's actually sort of what's called a negative opportunity gap. In other words, children who live in really remote rural schools tend to have more qualified teachers, which is exactly the opposite from many patterns we see across the globe. On the right, you see, on the right top, we see experience and community size. And what we see again is that, and that's the percentage of teachers with more than 20 years of experience. What we see on the left is that teacher experience is skewed toward more urban areas. More experienced teachers tend to be working in urban schools relative to rural schools. But on the right, we see South Korea. Again, we see that more experienced teachers are more likely to be in rural schools. So again, kind of an equitable arrangement, an equity enhancing arrangement in South Korea. And now on the bottom left, we have education and parental education. And so there we see the percentage of teachers percentage of schools whose teachers have different levels of educational attainment. And as we move from left to right, we have increasing levels of parental education in those schools. Again, we see in the schools with less educated parents, we see less educated teachers in Mexico. In other words, as we increase the average level of educational attainment in the school of parents, we see more educated teachers. So more educated teachers in schools with more advantaged kids in terms of educational attainment. And again, the opposite arrangement in South Korea, where more educated teachers tend to be in schools with less educated parents. And again, we see experience in parental education on the bottom right. we see a similar pattern where more experienced teachers in Mexico tend to be with more experience, with more educated schools with more educated parents, and the opposite in South Korea. In other words, Mexico has a very inequitable distribution of teachers, whereas South Korea has actually quite an equitable arrangement, at least across schools. And one of the reasons is that in Mexico, I mentioned that teacher assignment and transfer are really based on seniority. So you get to, as you get more seniority, you get to choose your teaching location. In South Korea, they actually have incentives to teach in less advantaged schools and difficult to staff schools. And they require that teachers rotate schools every 5 years. So this avoids the problem of teacher experience accumulating in certain types of schools. So policy can have an influence. And in general, Korea's system is just more oriented toward equity than Mexico's system. So this was just 2 countries. So we thought, okay, these are 2 very different countries, Mexico and South Korea. So with my colleague, Dr. Amita Chudgar, in about 2012, we started a big cross-national project related to teachers of marginalized children across the globe. And so we looked at about 25 countries in Latin America, in Asia, and in sub-Saharan Africa. And on the left, you see that we use the CERCE data. This is from UNESCO's office in Latin America and South America. We use those data to examine 8 countries: Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Cuba, Guatemala, Mexico, Peru, and Uruguay. In Asia, we used TIMS data, the Trends in International Math and Science Study data, to examine 7 countries: Hong Kong, Indonesia, we did examine Indonesia, Malaysia, Mongolia, Taipei, Thailand, and India. And in India, we used another data set called DICE. And in sub-Saharan Africa, we used 2 data sets: PASEC, which is administered in Francophone countries, French-speaking countries, and SACMEC, which is administered in English-speaking countries. And you can see the countries that we studied. And so we had dozens of countries, many different variables that we were trying to understand how teachers were distributed across schools and locations. So we had to come up with some way to kind of illustrate differences across countries. So what we came up with was this kind of graphical representation. And what you can see across the very top of the graph, you can see student characteristics. So you see high-low math score, high-low socioeconomic status, or SES, high-low mother's education, and the test language is spoken at the home or not spoken. So we're making comparisons in teacher characteristics across those student variables. And then those bars represent teacher characteristics. So the blue bars represent age, experience, and gender. So they're kind of more demographic variables of teachers. The green bars relate to training and preparation. And the orange bars relate to more kind of working conditions and attitudes of teachers. And so what you can see, this is just an example of what a really inequitable distribution looks like, because if you look at the 0 line in that graph where it says 0, and there's a line drawn across horizontally, if a bar is below that line, that represents that a certain teacher characteristic is negatively distributed. In other words, it's an equity dampening distribution, because it means that teacher characteristic tends to be disproportionately located with less advantaged students. So any graph where you see a lot of bars below the line means that that's an inequitable distribution, because the more advantaged children tend to have greater access to a certain teacher characteristic. And so here you can, yes? This is just one example of one country. This is just one, just to show what this means, because now I'm going to show you a graph from Asia. From Asia. This one is, I'm trying to remember, I think this might be from sub-Saharan Africa. I think this might be, you know, let me check the next graph. But this actually might be Indonesia. The next graph, I'll show you Indonesia. So this is just to show you, what does a really inequitable distribution look like? And you can see in Asia, on the left, Hong Kong, you see quite a few bars below the zero line. So that means there are inequitable distributions of certain teacher characteristics, but you also see bars above the line, which means that there are concentrations of important teacher characteristics that favor less advantaged children. And so what you can see is Hong Kong, of the countries we studied in Asia, tended to have the most equitable distribution of teachers. Whereas Indonesia, you can see nearly all of the bars are below that zero line, meaning that those teacher characteristics tend to be important teacher characteristics tend to be disproportionately concentrated with more advantaged students. In other words, less advantaged students tend to have less experienced, younger, less prepared teachers, and teachers who are less satisfied in their positions. So let's go back to see that previous graph to see if that is, in fact, no, it's not Indonesia. I think it's that country. This map or this graph, I think, is from, it might be from Namibia. It's a country in sub-Saharan Africa. And okay, so you see on the left, the more equitable distribution is in Hong Kong. The less equitable distribution is in Indonesia. But that makes sense, right? Because Hong Kong is very small. And so where you teach in Hong Kong, it isn't as big, it isn't as important. The stakes are not as high because you're still going to be pretty close to an urban center, no matter where you're teaching. In Indonesia, we know that distances are great, that there are many schools in very remote areas, which are very difficult for teachers to work in. And so, yes, imagine being, I know there are schools out on remote islands where teachers have to take a boat to get to their schools. So we can imagine why we might see this inequitable distribution of teachers. And in the middle, in terms of equity, we see Malaysia, Taipei, and Thailand. And on the right, in Mongolia, we see a similar distribution to that of Indonesia. In other words, a much more inequitable distribution. Yes. If you have a question, please stop me. But yes, Mongolia, again, has many remote rural areas, which are likely to be very difficult for teachers in terms of their conditions, living and working conditions. So this study, we did this analysis again in about 24 countries and 3 continents. And what we concluded from this study is that there's a compelling, systematic, cross-national evidence of unequal teacher distribution across most countries. And one thing we found are differences in demographic variables of teachers. Teachers of marginalized children tend to be male, younger, less experienced, and less qualified. And again, the problem of teacher gender is important, especially for girls in rural areas who don't have a lot of access to female teachers. Teachers of marginalized children are more dissatisfied with their working conditions and more likely to desire reassignment. So if you remember those orange bars, those related to whether teachers were satisfied and whether they wanted to be reassigned to other schools. And for the most part, yes, they did want to be reassigned, and they were dissatisfied because they were working in places that they found to be difficult to either work in or to live in, or both. Teacher sorting, this problem is particularly pronounced in terms of teacher test scores in sub-Saharan Africa and in teacher preparedness in Asia. Because teachers, in the TIMSS data, teachers respond to questions about how prepared they feel to teach certain subjects, and the distribution of that characteristic of teacher preparedness tended to favor more advantaged students. In other words, teachers of more advantaged students felt more prepared to teach. But of the 3 continents, on average, Asian countries have more equitable patterns than countries in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. Now, these broad patterns are interesting and important, but they really don't tell us why we see these differences across countries and what we can do about it, what we can do to solve this problem. In Asia, Hong Kong was particularly equitable, as I mentioned. Let me go back to that graph. Malaysia, Taiwan or Taipei and Thailand tended to be more on the equitable side. But if you look at Asia relative to Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, tended to be more equitable. And we think this is partially because in many Asian countries, teachers tend to have a much higher level, average level of preparation than teachers than the other countries. And so if teachers are there's a more uniform level of quality of teachers, then that's more likely to reduce, you're less likely to see big differences in teacher characteristics across locations because all teachers are kind of have a uniform level of preparation. So in order to look more closely at two specific countries that were quite different in terms of evidence, I did a study with my colleague, Professor Dongwook Jung from Seoul National University, in which we compared the United States and South Korea in terms of not just differences across schools, but differences within schools and teacher characteristics. And what you see here are Gini indexes. Those are measures of inequality. The higher the level, the more unequal a certain teacher characteristic. And you can see that in South Korea, across schools, there tended to be lower Ginis in terms of years of teaching experience, permanent employment of teachers, out of field teaching, and self-efficacy in instruction. And those tended to be lower, the Ginis tended to be lower across schools in South Korea, meaning a more equitable distribution of those characteristics. But then we looked actually across classrooms on the right, and you can see that the Ginis are much higher, which means there's more inequality across classrooms than there is across schools, which means there are big differences in what teachers look like across classes, even within the same schools. And even though we see South Korea still has lower scores than the United States, meaning more equality, but we still see pretty high Ginis even for South Korea in these variables, meaning that even South Korea, which the evidence suggests that is much more equitable, has some problems in terms of inequality of teacher resources across classrooms in schools. So again, those quantitative studies give us an idea of broad patterns, but they don't give us as much of an idea of what we can do to reduce these inequalities in access to qualified teachers. So I want to talk a little bit about the research in terms of what causes opportunity gaps in children's access to qualified teachers. So why do we see these opportunity gaps in terms of the access to qualified teachers? So there was a very early study of New York State in which the authors found that there were just systemic inequalities in teacher characteristics across schools. And they kind of hypothesized that teachers choose schools based on their preferences for working conditions like student populations. So in other words, teachers sort across schools because they want to work with certain types of students. There was a really important study, a cross-national study that was published in 2007 that found that some East Asian nations like Japan and South Korea had much more equitable concentrations of teachers. And so there was a response to that article by Kang and Hong, who are South Korean researchers, and they discussed why we see these more equitable patterns in South Korea, and they attribute them to uniformity and quality. In other words, all teachers are trained to a high level, and there's kind of a more uniform uniformly high quality teacher force. There's also rotation, as I mentioned before, rotation of teachers every 5 years. In other words, teachers cannot just all accumulate in one school, in one particular type of school, because after 5 years, they have to move to a different school. So that makes sure that we don't have all the inexperienced teachers in one certain type of school. And there are also incentives to teach disadvantaged children. In other words, you can receive career incentives, faster routes to promotion if you agree to teach in difficult to staff schools or remote rural schools. So there are actually policies that can be used to ameliorate these differences in teacher characteristics. I wrote a paper with my advisor from graduate school, Martin Carnoy, about Uruguay in South America. Uruguay has a very inequitable distribution of teachers. And we argued that this inequitable distribution stems in part from policies and practices that favor children of the elite, such as teacher hiring competitions. So when teachers finish their education in Uruguay, they take a test. And based on the score of their test, they can select their school. So you can imagine the high scoring teachers are going to select schools in urban areas with wealthier and higher achieving students. And this just is almost guaranteed to create and perpetuate inequality and children's access to school. The paper I wrote with my colleagues about South Korea and Mexico, we concluded that a more centralized system with greater commitment to equity will have more equal teacher distribution. So whereas a more centralized system, as in the United States, where teachers negotiate directly with either schools or districts for their positions, it's more likely in that kind of system that more qualified teachers will select to work in higher scoring or wealthier schools, because there's no kind of central authority determining what the needs are and where to place teachers. There's a paper that studies virtually all the schools in Washington State by Dan Goldhaber and colleagues that argues that teacher quality opportunity gaps may result from teacher preferences for more advantaged students, collective bargaining agreements, principal assignments, and student tracking. So there are a lot of practices and policies that may be related to these patterns of teacher quality. And then I wrote a paper with my colleague, Professor Dongwook Chung, related to arguing that there are some policy variables. There are things that education policy can do that are related to teacher sorting patterns, especially both cross schools and within schools in terms of how teachers are allocated. So policy can play a role. But I also wanted, so all of the studies I've described so far have been mainly quantitative and big kind of cross-national studies. But I really wanted, with my colleague, Dr. Amita Chugar, we really wanted to understand why we were seeing these patterns in the data. So we also did qualitative case studies of teacher distribution in 3 countries what were the 3 countries? India, Mexico, and Tanzania. So this followed our quantitative cross-national study, but we wanted to study a country in Asia, a country in Sub-Saharan Africa, and a country in Latin America. So we studied patterns of teacher distribution and policies related to inequitable teacher hiring practices and policies. In India, we studied 3 states. In Mexico, we studied 3 states in the federal district. And in Tanzania, we studied 3 provinces. And in each country, we were kind of looking at a more high achieving province or state, kind of a middle level province or state, and then a lower achieving province or state. And we went out into the field, we did interviews of policymakers, of teachers, of school leaders, because we really wanted to understand why we were seeing these patterns in the quantitative data. So I'm not gonna share all the results from all of the 3 countries, but I will share some results from Mexico, because we see particularly in unequal patterns in Mexico. So a researcher told me in Mexico City, marginalized children. So I asked the researcher, do marginalized children have equal access to qualified teachers? And she told me, marginalized children who represent the majority of children in Mexico, most children in Mexico are in fact marginalized in one way or another, do not have access to well-qualified teachers. The answer is maybe trivial, but there is no way, and the evidence is everywhere, that marginalized children do not have equal access to qualified teachers. A teacher educator in the southern state of Chiapas, which has a large population of indigenous children, told me, we give the most difficult positions to the least experienced. In other words, a teacher just finishes their education, their teacher preparation, we send them out to a school out in the middle of nowhere with few resources and little training and extremely difficult teaching conditions, which might include multi-grade schools where you have children from 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade all together. And you might have children who don't speak, in this case, Spanish, because they come from an indigenous family. They might speak an indigenous language. A researcher in Chiapas in the same state in southern Mexico told me, the quality of teachers is a huge problem in Chiapas and in other parts of southern Mexico. The more marginalized parts of Mexico always have a problem that there are not enough qualified teachers. So they really have difficulties staffing their classrooms, particularly in the most marginalized areas. A teacher in the southern state of Yucatan, which also has a large population of indigenous children, a lot of the descendants of the Mayas, in fact, told me the most unprepared teachers are sent to the highest need areas, but it should be exactly the opposite. It should be the case that the most prepared teachers, the highest quality teachers, are sent to the highest need areas where children really need them the most. But it's in fact the opposite. So from this study, the qualitative study combined with our quantitative results, these were some of the recommendations that we came up with. To ensure equity, transparency, and efficiency in initial hiring and transfers, because initial hiring and transfers are really where those inequities are emerging. When they first send the inexperienced teachers out to remote rural areas, and then through the transfer process in which teachers are working toward getting to urban centers. Recognize teacher concerns to make efficient teacher allocation decisions. For example, teachers in Mexico City were telling us, look, I teach on this side of the city, and I have to travel 2 hours to get to get home because I live on the other side of the city. And so the Mexican officials were actually telling us, yes, we're trying to work with teachers. We're trying to help them teach in places that are closer to home so they're not always trying to leave for a different school. Carefully design monetary and non-monetary incentives. So there are some systems that are trying to design incentives to get teachers to work in more difficult to staff areas, but you really have to design those incentives carefully because there are always unintended consequences when you offer teachers incentives, either monetary or non-monetary. Provide adequate and relevant teacher preparation and in-service training and support. So teachers who work in really difficult and complex environments like multi-grade schools in remote rural areas, they need specialized training because those are extremely complex teaching environments. And to serve children well, you really have to know what you're doing. And invest in local infrastructure and human capital with a focus on girls and women. And really, for example, in Tanzania and really remote areas, rural areas, there were no female teachers, partially because of the difficult living conditions, partially for cultural reasons. But imagine the impact that has on girls who never see an educated woman in their classroom as a teacher. If they just don't have those role models that they should have in order to encourage them to pursue further education. Finally, my colleague, Dr. Zhang and I, we did a cross-national study using the TALIS data again. And we wanted to understand if there's a relationship between levels of national development and what teacher distribution patterns look like. And what we find on the left is the mean squares between schools along the x-axis. In other words, the difference across schools in terms of teacher characteristics. How big are differences across schools and what teachers look like? And we're actually mapping this teacher quality variable that we created by combining teacher experience, teacher self-efficacy, teacher education level. Along the y-axis, we're looking at the mean squares within schools. So in other words, what do inequalities look like within schools across classrooms? And what we see in general, if teachers are different across schools, if teachers look very different across schools, they tend to look different also within schools. In other words, systems with more pronounced differences across schools also tend to have more pronounced differences within schools. And on the right, so the inequality is kind of compounded in those countries. And on the right, we see the gross national income per capita. So wealthier countries to the right are distributed across the right. On the left, we see the intra-class correlation coefficient, which is a measure of how different teacher characteristics are across schools. So in other words, the higher the intra-class correlation, the higher the differences in teacher characteristics across countries. And what we see is in the wealthier countries, there tend to be bigger differences within schools, whereas in the less wealthy countries, there tend to be differences across schools. And what this suggests is that in less developed countries, there's such big differences in working and living conditions across, for example, urban and rural areas, that the big problems are across schools, whereas in wealthier countries, they tend to be, the bigger differences tend to be within schools, because the differences in school teaching and living conditions aren't so large across, for example, urban and rural areas. So again, the concerns are different, in other words. In lower income countries, the concerns tend to be across schools. In higher income countries, tend to be teacher distribution within schools.
Professor Tom?
Yes.
10 more minutes.
10 more minutes, thank you.
Sorry.
That's okay. I think I'll have enough time. So what are the policy variables that are related to these differences in teacher qualifications? And so we did some analysis, and we did some regressions and some various statistical analyses. And what we found is, in terms of cross-school sorting differences across schools and teacher characteristics, is cross-school ability grouping, to the extent that schools choose different types of students across schools. That's positively related to sorting. In other words, there tend to be differences in teacher characteristics across schools when schools kind of discriminate in terms of who they admit to schooling. In terms of cross-classroom schooling, differences across classes and teacher characteristics, some factors that are negative related to sorting, in other words, that reduce inequalities, are cross-school ability grouping. So if schools choose different students according to school location, that reduces within school differences. But when there's no within school ability grouping, there's less sorting of teachers across classrooms. In other words, but things that are positive related to cross-classroom sorting are teacher incentives for career advancement. So some things to incentivize teachers in their careers, public posting of achievement data, and autonomy in curriculum and instruction. So so oftentimes policymakers will institute these incentives for teachers to do one thing or another, but sometimes those things relate to where teachers choose to teach in terms of the classrooms. So we have to be really careful in terms of how we design these various policies, because they may increase teacher sorting across classrooms. To summarize, how do we ensure equal access to qualified teachers across schools? In the Korean example, which is often given in the literature, employ uniformly well-prepared teachers, mandatory rotation of teachers, and incentives to teach in difficult to staff schools. And those things seem to be effective, at least in terms of cross-school distribution of teachers. In lower income contexts, rural development may provide a solution. Just to make rural areas more hospitable places to live for teachers can be an important policy to encourage teachers to work in rural areas. But we have to be aware of unintended consequences in terms of policies toward accountability, policies to incentivize teachers, because as we write in our paper, policies designed to promote educational efficiency, such as student tracking and grouping, teacher performance incentives, school accountability, and curricular or instructional autonomy, may have unintended consequences in terms of teacher sorting. So things that we design to try to incentivize teachers may incentivize them to do something else, like choose different classrooms or choose different schools, because they may be more likely to receive an award or some sort of incentive that's based on student achievement. So to summarize, although cross-classroom teacher sorting appears to be a problem in most countries, the evidence base is very thin. So we still need a lot more research about cross-classroom and within school sorting of teachers. There are two possible approaches that we argue. First is if we reduce within school ability grouping. In other words, in many schools, teachers will say, okay, we're going to put the low achieving kids in this second grade class, the high achieving kids in this second grade class. So then most teachers want to work with those high achieving students. If we reduce that ability grouping, we're less likely to see within school sorting of teachers. And to provide incentive, support, and training for teachers to work with learners with diverse backgrounds and knowledge. So those teachers who are working with the less advantaged or less prepared children need particular support and training to be successful. Now, I want to talk very briefly about inclusion because I've really talked about who is teaching where, but I haven't really talked about what they're doing in the classroom. And so I'm just going to provide some resources that actually are created by UNESCO because, as I mentioned, UNESCO is very focused on ensuring that we're achieving the Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. So every year, UNESCO publishes what's called the Global Education Monitoring Report. And every year it has a specific theme. And in 2020, the theme for the report was Inclusion for All. So the title of the report was Inclusion in Education, All Means All. And now I'm going to provide some slides that actually were designed by UNESCO. So identity, background, and ability still dictate education opportunities. In at least 20 countries, no poor rural young women complete secondary school. No one. No women or girls from poor rural areas complete secondary school. 10-year-olds in middle and high-income countries are not learning in their mother tongue. Not learning in their mother tongue are 34% less likely to have basic reading skills. So UNESCO is encouraging more native language instruction. Refugees are 3 times more likely to be out of secondary school, and children with disabilities are 2.5 times more likely to never go to school than their peers. And so these are all challenges for inclusive education. So what are some of the recommendations of UNESCO? We need to widen the understanding of inclusive education to include all regardless of identity, background, or ability. In the United States, the term inclusion, we tend to refer to it to discuss including students with disabilities into classrooms. But what UNESCO is encouraging is a wider perspective on inclusion. And for countries, and so UNESCO is encouraging a more inclusive definition, a wider definition of inclusion, but only 57% of countries that have a definition cover multiple marginalized groups. So UNESCO encourages the application of universal design to ensure inclusive systems to fulfill learners' potential. So that might include what textbooks look like, how the curriculum that children have access to, how assessments demonstrate learning, and what textbooks may look like and whether they're inclusive and include representation of all students. So what is universal design for learning? UNESCO, where the organization ahead defines it as a set of principles for curriculum development that give all individuals equal opportunities to learn, including students with disabilities. UDL aims to improve the educational experience of all students by introducing more flexible methods of teaching, assessment, and service provision to cater for the diversity of learners in our classroom, to make instruction accessible to all. And on the right, you can see the core principles of UDL: multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression. And teachers, of course, need to be empowered to teach in an inclusive fashion. All teacher education should teach about inclusion. Head teachers should create an inclusive school ethos, and we should ensure a diverse education workforce. But 1/4 of teachers reported high need for training on teaching students with special needs. So we still have a lot of challenges for inclusive education. So I'd just like to conclude with a set of questions for all of you, because I'm interested to know, who are the most marginalized children in Indonesia? Are they children in rural areas? Are they children from certain ethnic backgrounds, children experiencing certain types of environmental crises or conflict? Do they have access to qualified teachers? If not, I'm sorry, that says teaches, not teachers. If not, what are the challenges to providing equitable access? Because I've read a little bit about this issue of teacher distribution in Indonesia, and mainly the research is about urban-rural differences, but I imagine there are many other challenges to ensuring equitable access and inclusion for all students. How is inclusion defined in Indonesia? As I mentioned, in the US, it tends to be related to students with disabilities and including them in regular classes. And are teachers trained to include all students in teaching and learning? And so those are some of the questions we might discuss, but I'm happy to answer any other questions that you may have. Thank you. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much, Professor Tom. Let's give a round of applause one more time for Professor Tom's presentation. All right, please have a seat. It is a very insightful presentation, right? Yes, okay. So to ensure equal access for students with the high quality teachers, it's not only the teacher itself, right? So the role of the government is really important. Yes.
Yes, as I mentioned, there are lots of policies. Oftentimes the literature research kind of blames this problem on teachers, but you can't blame teachers for wanting to work in more pleasant or more environments where they feel like they're more successful. So the government does have an important role to play.
All right, and we want to know more about this issue, so I will give an opportunity for the audience here to raise a question. Okay, Pak Benny, maybe 3 questions for this term. Pak Diki, you can just ask later on. No. Pak Diki will get mad at me. Pak Benny, Pak Diki, and Pak Dodi. All right. No, Ibu? Later, all right. Pak Benny first.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi, Pak Tom. It's been a long time since we work on BIPA.
Yes, I remember. We were just talking about
I'm still Benny, that you know. We were with Mike Spector, Dr. Mike Spector, developing the BIPA long time ago, 30 or 10 years ago, perhaps. I have forgotten. It is a very interesting speech, and I learned so much from you. Yeah, globally, with the conditions of education, the teachers all over the world. Yeah, in your presentation, and I think our country is so much different from. It's not so much different from Mexico. Which is marginalized students with lower qualified teachers, and this distribution problem, access to lower access to qualified teachers. And I was looking forward to hearing you about the incentives or bonuses for teachers who works in rural areas, and it was answered in the presentation. But I particularly interested to know. Sorry, I just recollect what I'm talking about. What other countries may have solved, like South Korea, in handling this inequitable unequal access. Yeah. But it seems that the policy is the most factor that may have impact the changing of the situation. I wonder you would give us more recommendation for what we have to do, because we face a serious problem with the distribution and the quality of teachers as reflected by the PISA index, which is very low. The students' achievement, the literacy, the student literacy, and the students berhitung itu apa? Oh, numeracy. Thank you for the chance given to me. Dian. Terima
Yep.
kasih.
You're welcome, Pak Benny. Is it clear enough? for you?
Yes.
Okay.
So thank you for your question. And as you were talking, I remembered what country that was. The first graph I showed was Guatemala in Central America. And one of the findings was that so there was one student variable, language of the test spoken at home or not. And so in Guatemala, students who don't speak the language of the test at home are indigenous children. And so we saw big differences in teacher characteristics across indigenous and non-indigenous children. So the question I posed about Indonesia, if I were to pose that about Guatemala, would really be, who are the most marginalized children? I think it would probably be indigenous children, because there's a lot of places where they live and have much fewer resources, and there's a lot of bias and prejudice against indigenous children. So just because you had asked, I wanted to give you that information because I just remembered it. But to answer your question, I mean, I think there are a lot of things that governments can do. One is, of course, incentives to teach in difficult to staff schools. And there's emerging evidence internationally and in the United States that those incentives are working when they're designed properly. But one of the things you have to really be able to do is identify, how do teachers weigh this trade-off between their compensation and their working conditions? And are you providing enough of an incentive, whether it's through salary or something else, to induce teachers to teach in certain types of schools? But another consideration is, who are the teachers you're trying to induce? Do you want to give an incentive for any teacher to teach in a difficult to staff school? Or do you want to incentivize certain types of teachers? So there's actually a new paper that just came out from the United States, from, I believe it was Dallas, Texas, where they're using a system where they're identifying effective teachers through value-added scores and other measures, and they're providing an incentive for those teachers to teach in difficult to staff schools, but only focused on those particular teachers who have demonstrated effectiveness. And it seems like they have been successful in encouraging teachers to go to those schools. But as soon as the incentive ends, as soon as they no longer have that incentive, they leave. So they have to consistently receive that incentive in order to stay in those schools. And then one more policy that I think over the long term can be effective is to invest, as I said, one of our policy recommendations from our qualitative study was to invest in local infrastructure, both physical and human infrastructure, and invest in children and youth, and encourage children and youth in, for example, remote rural areas to become teachers, because they're more likely to stay for the long term and to invest in the community. If any of you saw my talk yesterday, I gave the example of a teacher in a rural school in Bogor, outside of Bogor, West Java. And that teacher was amazing, incredible. But I had an opportunity to interview her, and she was from that community. So she was very invested in that community for the long term. And so she understood the children, she understood the families, and she really cared about education in that community. So that's, I mean, that's a lot of answers. I don't know if I answered your question, but they're really important. It's a really important question.
Thank you, Tom. Who is the teacher in Bogor?
I don't know her name, but she was an excellent. I saw her maybe, this is 15 years ago, but she struck me so much what she was doing in the class in terms of innovating and reaching all the students that I still think of her as an example.
I just wonder if she just graduated from UT.
Maybe so. Maybe she was a student of. I'm trying to remember now. I think she was a student. I think she was an UT student. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
All right. Thank you. You should visit Bogor again.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would love to see that teacher again. You're
Yes.
from Bogor? Oh. I have a picture of her. I'll show you a picture.
All right. Later on.
Yes. I'm sure you're an excellent teacher.
All right. Thank you, Pak Benny and Prof. Tom. Okay, for the second question by Pak Diki. You're a longtime friend?
Yes, and an alumnus of Claremont Graduate University.
I'm sorry, Pak Diki. I think you have to.
It covers many countries, and I'm interested in a possibility if you do longitudinal studies in certain countries or in one country, it can be some changes in policy over time. So perhaps in Mexico, in South Korea, or in Indonesia, there are changes in the policy, and we can see. You mentioned that there are some incentive and unintended consequences of some incentives or some changing of the policy. I suggest a longitudinal studies, and it can be a collaboration between UT and CGU, for example, because one of our goal is to have a collaboration among between universities. So longitudinal studies in certain countries about the changing of a policy in teacher quality or incentive. Thank you.
Thank you, Dicky. I think that's an excellent idea, and I'm very excited to collaborate with.
Yes, and Budewi Padma is here, our head of research institute.
And yes, I'm very interested in collaborating, and I think that's a great idea to do a longitudinal study because, as you say, policies are changing, and maybe we're seeing differences. Maybe South Korea is becoming less equitable and Indonesia is becoming more equitable, but we don't know until we actually look at the data. So it's important to find data sources for that sort of work. We use TIM's data to study Asia, but I think that as more countries are participating in the TALIS, the OECD's TALIS study, that really helps us because that's focused more on teachers. But I will congratulate Indonesia in being a consistent, long-time participant in the TIM studies because it really does provide, those cross-national studies really do provide a source of data to examine questions like this over time. So thank you, and I'm happy to discuss further our potential collaborations.
All right. Thank you, Pak Diki and Professor Tom. Before we go to the online question, one more question from Pak Dodi, our Vice Dean of Academics.
Thank you for the time, Budian. This is related, especially I think, to my task as academic affairs. To be honest, we used to ask Google to ask questions. What exactly is inclusive education? But this morning I did ask Mr. ChatGPT, what exactly did inclusive education? And And I wondered, I find one term, UDL, Universal Design for Learning. And I'm glad and happy that you mentioned also as well about UDL. I think we are looking for possibilities to design this kind of UDL. Do you think would they have possibilities to do that? And which countries, which school who already practice UDL, and maybe we can comparative study or study visit with them, and then that's one question about UDL. The second question is that I wonder about the Gini index.
Yes.
My understanding is that the smaller the Gini index, it is the more equitable education or which can access it. And I wonder why do you focus only on 4 variable or indicators you mentioned in the previous table, and one of indicators is that out of the field. Does this mean that teachers who teach different with his background? For example, his background is mathematics, but he teaches language, for example. Why do you focus on 4 variables? That's my question. Okay,
Thank you. So for the first question about UDL, I think if anyone is qualified to employ and instill UDL, it's Universitas Terbuka, because I've seen, I came here for many years. I haven't been back, but yesterday I took a tour of the learning materials distribution center, of the instructional design center, of the multimedia center, and I think your systems are such that you have such great capacity and such reach across Indonesia that you certainly could be a leader, not just in Indonesia, but in the world, in creating universal design for learning for your students in your learning materials and your instruction. In terms of exemplars, I would take a strong look at the Global Education Monitoring Report from UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Report from 2020, because they do provide a lot of country examples of who was out in front. Like, for example, Italy was a country that was out in front in terms of inclusive education and broadening that definition, and in terms of universal design for learning. But I would take a good look at that report to see who were some good examples. And in addition to the report, they commissioned a lot of background reports. So there's a lot published about those themes by UNESCO. And in terms of your second question, why we focused on those 4 measures, and this is a limitation of quantitative secondary analysis of data. Those are the measures that were available in the TALIS data set that were related to teacher quality. Of course, we would like to have measures about teachers' knowledge, about teachers' empathy, but really we had access to those, to teachers' experience, teacher education level, how teachers felt about their own efficacy, and then out-of-field teaching. And we needed kind of a continuous measure in order to do the Gini, the calculation of the Gini index. So that's what we had. And so that's what we used. But in addition to that, we created a variable, kind of an overall teacher quality variable that combined those measures. So we had an additional kind of measure to sort of triangulate those results.
I would like to know as well, our country, for instance, not only Korea and
yes.
For America as well.
Well, I don't know if Indonesia participates now in TALIS, but in those data, Indonesia was not in TALIS, and we would need Indonesia. So if you have influence in the Indonesian government to tell them participate in the TALIS, then that would enable future analysis. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Pak Dodi. I think we've got so many motivations today, including to join in TALIS. I hope we can do that in the future. So we will know more about our country's condition about education. Okay. We'll move on to the online question from the audience. But before that, can you please greet the online audience? Professor Tom, like say hello to them.
Hello, virtual audience. Hello, online audience. I became comfortable teaching online during the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, I did not like teaching online, I must admit, but I'm much more comfortable, but I'm not sure who to look at. But I know that Universitas Terbuka had a large advantage when the pandemic came and you became sort of a national leader for teaching online, distant online and virtual teaching. So hello, online audience.
Thank you, Prof. Tom.
It's great to meet you all.
No wonder it's your 8th time coming here. So your relation with Universitas Terbuka must be very strong, right?
Yes.
You know about it. All right.
Many friends here.
Yes. This is the first question. You can also see the screen, but I will read it for you. The question is from Anissa from Jakarta. How do we improve teacher experience in inclusive education while the distribution is unequal?
That's a really great question, Anissa. Thank you for your question. I think this might be, actually there might be sort of a counterintuitive, I'm just hypothesizing here, but it might be the case that newer teachers might know more about inclusive education because it's becoming more common in teacher preparation. So it might be the case that in schools where there are a lot of new teachers, which often happens in, for example, remote rural schools, there's more knowledge of inclusive education because teachers are coming straight from teacher preparation. Maybe they're coming from their S1 degrees with Universitas Terbuka and they're learning about inclusive education. So I actually, in this case, I think that maybe part of the answer is to encourage younger, newer teachers to work and collaborate with their more experienced colleagues to teach them about inclusive education. I mean, this is just my hypothesis. I could be wrong, but I feel like newer, younger teachers might have a better idea about how to teach inclusively than more experienced teachers.
All right, so Anissa, I hope Professor Tom already answered your question. Let's go on to the next question. All right. From Eka, UT Denpasar. Wow, you'll go there soon, right? Bali. What are the important points of inclusiveness that need attention for open and distance education systems?
Thank you, Eka. I hope I see you in Denpasar. I'll be there soon. I'll be there this evening, I think. So thank you for your question. I think this is a really, really important question. I think for inclusiveness, for open and distance education systems, of course, we have to be aware of the extent to which students have access to technology, have experience and knowledge of technology, if we're talking about online education, for example, or have access to learning materials. I know that UT sends learning materials all over, not just Indonesia, but the world. So I think that your approach is inclusive, but I think probably as the world is going more toward online and virtual education, it will be that access to and knowledge of technology and ensuring that students in places where there is very little access. We saw yesterday in Professor Daryono's presentation that outside of major cities in Indonesia, oftentimes there's very little access to internet and bandwidth decreases substantially outside of urban centers. So I think that's a really important consideration.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Tom. Go on to the next question. All right. I think I have to be there because it's quite long. All right. Considering the complexities involved, this is from Miss Ami Batojami. Oh, I know her. She's from ICE Institute. Could you share some practical examples or case studies where schools or regions have successfully implemented strategies to bridge this gap and provide meaningful support to both teachers and students? Is it clear enough for you?
Yes,
Okay.
it's just a very.
If not, we can call her.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, that's a great question, and I'm kind of racking my brain to think of it a good example, because I don't think it's happened very often where schools or regions have successfully implemented strategies. I guess the example that I gave from Dallas, Texas, where they're providing incentives, they're targeting incentives, salary incentives for effective teachers as measured through various things like value-added impact on test scores. I think that's one example in Dallas, Texas, and there's a paper that I can share. I just have to find the reference. That might be one example. I think another very promising approach is what's called a grow your own strategy. And that means investing in children and youth in a local area, as I mentioned before, and encouraging young people to become teachers, because those young people are going to be likely to be more invested and stay around and as teachers in the places where they grew up. So I think that could be a good example as well of a successful strategy.
Okay, Ms. Ami, I hope Professor Tom answered your question. Yes. I think we'll still have some time. So maybe one question from the audience here in this room and one question, Pak Mehmet. All right. Any other question? No? Okay. Please, Pak Mehmet.
Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning from Tom's.
Morning.
Welcome to Indonesia. Hopefully happy in Indonesia and especially at Universitas Terbuka.
Thank you.
Prof. Tom, currently in the government of Indonesia, in accepting new students applies a zoning system. And then for parent information achievement system. Yeah. And then in our country, we have curriculum management. For example, the 2013 curriculum, and then now famous about MPKM is like Merdeka curriculum or freelance curriculum maybe, yeah, freedom curriculum, sorry, and so on. So in addition, you mentioned before about special training for teachers in rural area. Yes, special training. So I want to know about management special training and then curriculum for special training in rural area, and then about everyone about special training in rural area in other countries, especially in urban and rural area. Yes. Okay, that's one from question from me. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you. Well, I would like to talk about one program in particular that I talked about yesterday, but which I've studied in Colombia. And this is a rural school development model called Escuela Nueva, which means new school in Spanish. And this Escuela Nueva program was developed for really remote rural schools in the 1970s in Colombia, because there was a big challenge, not just because of rurality and remoteness, but because of the conflict that it has existed in Colombia for many years, the civil conflict between paramilitary groups, drug traffickers, and so forth. And this model of Escuela Nueva provides support for rural teachers by giving them specific training around how to work in a multi-grade environment, because these schools have grades 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 all together in a classroom, in a small classroom. And so that's a very complex teaching environment. So the teachers receive training not just in how to manage a classroom like that, but in how to use learning materials and curriculum guides, so that students are working collaboratively and individually or in small groups, and teachers are kind of surrendering a little bit of their authority to give more authority to students, so the instruction is more student-centered, and they become more kind of facilitators. And students in this model take on a really important role, not just in their own learning and assessing their own learning and in taking charge of what they learn, but also in running and contributing to school leadership. School governance in this model of Escuela Nueva is really important because the teacher can't do it all. Students have to take some role, and students are empowered in this model. But as I mentioned, these contexts are very complex, and teachers really need to know how to use the learning materials and how to empower students, and to understand that it's okay to give students some more power, to empower students to take charge of their own learning. So I guess that's a model that I would pose to sort of answer the question of curriculum and teacher support. I think students could have more, and maybe this is kind of related to what you were talking about a more freedom in the curriculum to allow students to have more agency in what they learn and how they learn. So I don't know if I answered your question, but thank you.
Okay.
Who does the training? The local government or the heads the central government?
So Colombia is a pretty decentralized system. So local governments, municipal governments are the one who decide whether and how much whether they use this program and whether they train the teachers and how much they invest in teacher training. It's pretty decentralized.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Pak Mehmet, Pak Beni. So it is also good for students to be independent, right? I think that's all. We had already 7 questions. And I think this is the end of our session. Thank you very much. Please give a round of big applause for Professor Tom.
Terima kasih.
For attending our event in this visiting lecture today. Hope you can come back again, meet us, and we can do another collaboration.
Yes, I hope so.
All right, thank you very much. I will give back the event to Ibu Suci Nurhayati. We want you to be here still, all right? Please, Ibu Suci.
Okay, thank you, Siti Hadianti, MPD, who has led this visiting lecture. Thank you and tremendous appreciation to Professor Thomas Luzei, PhD, who has given a presentation related to equitable access to high-quality teachers, bridging the gap in inclusive education. Now we will give a token of appreciation to Professor Thomas Luzei, PhD, by the Dean of the Faculty of Education and Teacher Training, Universitas Terbuka. Professor Thomas Luzei, PhD, and Professor Dr. Ucu Rahayu, MSc, please to come forward. Okay, thank you, Professor Thomas Luzei, PhD, and Professor Dr. Ucu Rahayu, MSc. Please remain on the stage. We will take a group photo. We invite all Vice Dean of Faculty of Education and Teacher Training, Universitas Terbuka, and Head of the Research and Community Service Institute. Okay, yes. The second part, group photo with the audience. Please turn around. Yes. With all of the audience in this room. So you can please all rise. So we take a photo. Oh yes, the audience can moving forward like that. Okay, for the audience in the Zoom, yes, maybe you can open the camera. For the organizer, you may please prepare for the configuration or setting, maybe. Okay. Okay, how many slide? Maybe I will guide it. For the first slide, yes, I will guide. The first slide, please. One, prepare it. 1, 2, and 3. Okay, next. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Next. 1, 2, and 3. Okay, this one the last. 1, 2, and 3. Okay, thank you. Well, before we end this forum, we will draw the selected question from the participants to get 3 prizes. The organizer, please display all the wheel of a name. I will start the first winner from 7, maybe 7. Can we start? Okay. Stop. Who's that? Okay, congratulations to Pak Mehmet. For the second winner, stop. Who's that? Okay, congratulations to Eka Yuliawan. Yes, from UT Denpasar. And the last for the third winners, stop. Who's that? Okay, congratulations to Pak Benny. Okay, the name of the winners will be contacted by the committee by email. To all participants, please fill out the online feedback from no later than 60 minutes after the event is over. And as certificated will be download the speaker's presentation material through a link that provided by the Faculty of Education and Teacher Training Universitas Terbuka 2023 Committee. I would like to express sincere gratitude to the speakers, organizer, and everyone who took part in this event. As a host too, I would like to apologize for any mistakes that may be occurred. Good afternoon and see you again at the next event. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.